There was a man, we'll call him Walter, who spent 41 years running a small hardware store in a town most people couldn't find on a map. Walter was good at his job, reliable. The kind of man neighbors trusted with a spare key. But Walter had a brother he stopped speaking to in 1987 over money that by the time Walter turned 70, he couldn't even remember the exact amount of. 30-some years of silence over a sum he'd forgotten. When his brother died, Walter didn't cry at the funeral. He told people later that the tears came 3 weeks after, while he was alone, restocking nails into little grey bins, and it hit him. Not the grief of losing his brother, but the grief of losing the decades he could have had with him. I want you to notice something about that story, because it's the pattern underneath almost every regret you or I will ever carry. It is rarely about the big, dramatic failure. It's about the small door we assumed would stay open forever. We tell ourselves a quiet lie. And I want you to really hear this, because you have probably told yourself some version of it this year. There will be time later. Later to call. Later to forgive. Later to say it out loud. Later to try the thing you actually wanted, instead of the thing that was expected of you. Psychologists who study regret, real research, not folk wisdom, have found something that surprises most people. When you ask someone in their 20s or 30s what they regret, they mostly talk about mistakes. The bad decision, the wrong move, the thing they did. But ask someone in their 60s, 70s, 80s the same question, and the answer changes almost completely. The regret shifts from what I did to what I didn't do, the unsent letter, the unspoken apology. The risk never taken, the love never declared. This is called in the research the difference between asterisk regrets of action and regrets of inaction. And inaction regrets last longer, hurt deeper, and are far harder to make peace with, because a mistake you made has an ending. A door you never opened stays open in your imagination forever. So if you're sitting there right now with a weight in your chest, a name you haven't said out loud in years, a version of yourself you quietly buried to keep the peace, I want you to know something before we go any further. That weight is not a sentence. It's not proof that you failed at life. It's information. And in the next chapter, I'm going to show you why almost everyone misreads it and how to read it correctly, maybe for the first time. There is a phrase that has quietly ended more good things than almost any other sentence in the English language. It's too late now. Too late to reconcile. Too late to change careers. Too late to fall in love again. Too late to learn something new, to apologize, to become someone slightly different than the person you've been for the last 30 years. I want to challenge that phrase, not with empty positivity, but with something closer to the truth. Too late is almost never a fact. It's a feeling wearing the costume of a fact, and the two behave very differently. A fact doesn't change, no matter how you look at it. 2 + 2 is 4 in the morning and at midnight. But a feeling like too late shifts entirely depending on the frame you put around it. Ask yourself honestly, too late compared to what? Too late compared to if you'd done it 20 years ago, sure. But compared to never doing it at all, compared to the version of you 10 years from now, looking back at today, wondering why you waited even longer. There's a woman we'll call Marion, a retired school teacher who spent 32 years grading essays and going home to an empty house on Fridays. At 66, she decided she wanted to learn to paint, something she'd wanted since she was a girl, before life filled up with responsibilities that always seemed to matter more. Her daughter, gently, asked her, Mom, why now? You're 66. And Marion said something that I think about often. I'll be 66 either way. The only question is whether I'll be 66 who paints or 66 who still wishes she did. That's the entire trick too late plays on us. It makes us believe that not starting somehow protects us from the passage of time. It doesn't. Time passes regardless. The only real choice is what we fill it with while it does. Now, I'm not going to insult you by pretending every regret can be undone. Some doors really have closed. The brother who died, the parent who's gone, the years that genuinely cannot be replayed. But here's the distinction almost nobody draws clearly enough. As this, you cannot undo the past, but you are not actually trying to undo the past. You are trying to change your relationship to it. And that, unlike the past itself, is always still available to you. This is the part people skip past too quickly. So let's slow down here. There are broadly two kinds of regret you'll carry into your later years. The first is the kind you can still act on. The relationship that's strained but not dead. The dream that's delayed but not impossible. The skill, the trip, the conversation, still reachable if you're willing to reach. The second is the kind that's permanently closed. Someone who's passed. A chapter that truly cannot reopen. And here's what almost nobody tells you. The second kind is not actually about the person or the event anymore. It's about you now and how you choose to carry it. Asterisk. You cannot call your brother back from the grave. But you can become the kind of person who doesn't let a small grudge calcify into 30 years of silence with someone else who's still here. That's not too late. That's the lesson finally being put to use, which is the only real redemption regret ever offers. We'll come back to exactly how to do that. But first, I want to talk about something even harder to admit, the conversations we're still avoiding right now, today. Think of one conversation, just one, that you have been putting off for longer than you'd like to admit. Maybe it's with a son who doesn't call as much as he used to. A sister you love, but somehow can't quite forgive. An old friend you drifted from after a disagreement that, if you're honest, wasn't even that serious. A version of I'm sorry or I forgive you or I was wrong that has been sitting in your chest for years, fully formed and never spoken. We avoid these conversations for reasons that feel completely rational in the moment. It's not the right time. They're not ready to hear it. It'll just cause more conflict. I don't want to open old wounds. I want to gently suggest that most of those reasons are not really about timing. They're about fear, the fear of finding out that the door is actually closed, that saying it out loud might make it real and irreversible. As long as the words stay unsaid, we get to keep a small, fragile hope alive. Speaking them risks losing even that, but here is the cost of that strategy. And it's a cost most people never calculate until it's far too late to pay it back. Asterisk, unspoken words don't disappear. They just change addresses. They move from the conversation into your body, into sleepless nights, into the tightness in your chest when their name comes up, into the quiet estrangement that outlives the original conflict by decades. There's an old idea found in some form in nearly every wisdom tradition, Eastern and Western alike, that we carry our unfinished business the way a person carries a stone in their pocket. It's not heavy enough to stop you from walking, but it's there every single day, in every single step, for years, sometimes for the rest of a life. So let me ask you something directly, and I want you to actually sit with the answer, instead of rushing past it the way we usually do. If you knew with total certainty that you had exactly 1 year left with that person, would you still wait? Most people, when they're honest, say no. And that's the tell. That's the sign that the delay was never really about the right time. It was about the fear of the moment itself. I'm not telling you every conversation ends in reconciliation. Some people aren't ready. Some relationships genuinely can't be repaired. At least not yet, maybe not ever. That's real, and I won't pretend otherwise. But there is a difference, a massive difference, between reaching out and being met with silence and never reaching out at all. The first one hurts, but it's clean, it's complete. You did what was yours to do. The second one festers because it stays open-ended forever, and open-ended pain is the heaviest kind there is. So here is the first real practical piece of this video. Pick the one conversation you've been avoiding. You already know which one you knew before I even finished the sentence, and this week, take one small step toward it. Not the whole conversation, just one step. A text, a call you don't script in advance, a letter, even if you never send it, because sometimes writing the words down is what finally lets you say them out loud. Because here's the truth underneath everything we've talked about so far. It is never the big gestures that heal a life. It's the small, uncomfortable, honest moments we finally stop avoiding. Now, I want to turn to something even deeper, because avoiding a conversation with someone else is one thing. But there's a conversation almost nobody has, the one with an old version of themselves. Here is something that took me a long time to understand, and I suspect it will take you a moment too, so give it room. A great deal of what we call regret isn't actually grief over an event. It's grief over a version of ourselves we had to leave behind in order to survive whatever life handed us, the ambitious 25-year-old who had a plan for everything. The parent who believed they'd never lose their temper the way their own parents did. The spouse who promised at the altar a version of love that daily life quietly wore down at the edges. The dreamer who was told, gently or not so gently, to be realistic. We don't just lose opportunities as we age. We lose versions of ourselves. And nobody teaches us how to grieve that properly. So instead, we carry those old selves around like ghosts, comparing our real, lived, imperfect life against a life that person was going to have. And we almost always lose that comparison because the imagined life never had to survive contact with reality. There was an old carpenter I heard about once. We'll call him Samuel, who built furniture for nearly 50 years. Late in life, someone asked him what he'd learned from 5 decades of woodworking, expecting some technical answer about grain and joints and finish. He said, "Every piece of wood has a plan for what it wants to become. My job was never to force my first idea onto it. My job was to notice what it was becoming and build with that instead." I think a life works the same way. We arrive with a plan, the person we assumed we'd be at 50, at 60, at retirement, and then life, like grain in wood, has its own direction. The people we lost, the paths that closed, the versions of ourselves that had to be set down. None of that means the whole project failed. It means you were building with the actual material of your actual life, instead of forcing it to match a blueprint drawn by someone who'd never lived a single day of it. This is the release almost nobody gives themselves permission to have. Asterisk, you are allowed to grieve the version of yourself you didn't become and still fully embrace the version of yourself you actually are, not instead of. Both, at the same time. That's not defeat. That's what maturity actually looks like underneath all the noise. And once you let that old self rest, not erase it, not pretend it didn't matter, just let it finally lie down, something remarkable becomes possible. You stop measuring today against a fictional yesterday. And for the first time in a long time, you get to ask a completely different question. Not what did I fail to become, but who do I still get to become, starting now? That question is where we're headed next. Here is something that neuroscience and psychology have confirmed, though wise people have known it for centuries in plainer language. The story you tell about your past is not fixed. It is actively rewritten every single time you tell it. Asterisk, this isn't about denial or pretending hard things didn't happen. It's about something called narrative reframing. And it might be the single most powerful tool available to anyone carrying regret into their later years. Here's how it works. 2 people can experience the exact same difficult event, a failed marriage, a career that ended earlier than planned, a friendship that dissolved, and walk away with completely different lives, not because the event was different, but because the story they told about it was different. One person tells it as, I wasted 20 years. The other tells it as, I learned over 20 years exactly what I needed to protect for the next chapter. Same 20 years, same facts. Two entirely different lives lived afterward, because the story shapes what comes next far more than the event itself ever did. Marion, the woman we met earlier who took up painting at 66, didn't just start a new hobby. She rewrote her story. For years, her story had been, I gave my whole life to other people's children and never had time for my own dreams. True, as far as it went. But it was only half the story, and she'd been living inside the smaller half, the fuller story, the one she eventually learned to tell, was, I spent 32 years pouring myself into thousands of children who needed someone steady in their lives. And now it's my turn, and I finally have the time to do it. Same life, same facts, a completely different weight to carry. I want to be careful here, because this idea gets abused sometimes into toxic positivity. Just think positive nonsense that pretends pain isn't real. That's not what this is. Walter's grief over his brother was real, and it should have been real. Pretending it wasn't would have been its own kind of lie. The goal isn't to erase the hard chapters or pretend they didn't hurt. The goal is to notice that you have been telling yourself only one version of a story that actually has several true versions available, and you get to choose which one you build the rest of your life on top of. So here's a practical exercise. And I want you to actually do this, not just listen to it. Take the regret that's been sitting heaviest on you. Write down, honestly, the story you've been telling yourself about it, the smallest, harshest version. Then ask, what is also true that I've been leaving out? What did that hard chapter teach me that I've used since? Even without realizing it, who am I now? Partly because of that chapter, not in spite of it. You're not lying to yourself. You're finishing a story you left half told, and once that story is more complete, something shifts. The regret stops being a locked room you avoid walking past. It becomes a room you can walk through. Still real, still part of the house, but no longer somewhere you are afraid to go. We tend to imagine second chances as dramatic, a sweeping cinematic moment where everything gets fixed at once. The estranged family reunites at the hospital bed. The dream finally comes true in one triumphant scene. Real second chances almost never look like that. They're quieter, smaller, and far more available than the version we see in movies, which is exactly why so many people miss them, waiting for a grand moment that was never going to arrive in the first place. A second chance in real life usually looks like this: picking up the phone today instead of eventually, signing up for the class instead of just thinking about it one more year, saying I love you out loud to someone you assumed already knew, forgiving someone not because they earned it, but because you're finally ready to set the weight down. Walter, the hardware store owner, never got a second chance with his brother. That door was truly closed. But 3 years after the funeral, his estranged nephew, his brother's son, reached out. And this time, Walter didn't wait. He didn't let pride or awkwardness or the fear of an uncomfortable conversation stand in the way. He picked up the phone that same day. That relationship with the nephew became, in Walter's own words late in his life, the thing I'm proudest of out of everything. Not because it undid the loss of his brother. Nothing could. But because he had finally learned to read his own regret correctly, and he refused to let the same lesson cost him twice. That's what a second chance actually is. Not a reversal of the past. Asterisk. An application of what the past finally taught you, aimed at whatever time you still have left. And here's the part I most want you to take with you. You don't need decades to make this real. You don't need to fix everything. You need one phone call, one honest sentence, one class you finally sign up for, one old friend you finally text back. Small and real beats grand and imagined every single time, because small and real actually happens, and grand and imagined usually just stays a thought until it's genuinely too late. So gently, I'll ask you the same question I asked earlier, but from a different angle now that we've walked through all of this together. What is the one small, real, second chance sitting in front of you right now? Today, that you've been treating as if it were grand and impossible, when really it's just been waiting for you to make it small enough to actually do. Here's what I want you to carry with you when this video ends and the room goes quiet again. Regret is not the proof that your life went wrong. It is the part of you that still cares deeply enough to notice what mattered. People who feel nothing looking back rarely learn anything looking forward. The ache you carry is, strangely, a form of love that never found its full expression, and love, even delayed, even imperfect, is never actually wasted. It's just waiting for you to finally give it somewhere to go. You cannot go back and call your brother in 1987. You cannot undo the version of yourself that had to be set down along the way. But you can, starting today, become the person your own hard-earned wisdom has been quietly trying to build. The years ahead of you are not a shrinking window closing in on you. They are the only place left where anything you've learned can actually be used. So take the conversation, take the class, make the call, say the sentence you've been carrying. Not because it erases what came before, but because it finally lets what came before mean something. If this found you at the right moment, stay a while longer. There's more waiting for you below.